So welcome to Sociology of the Family. I'm Dr. Beverly and Thompson.
And I am Akello Stone.
And today we're talking about Chapter 9, Families and Children.
You know, right away, the chapter really starts to talk about like what defines the family and people's perception of the family. Does a family in its own definition require that you have children? And from my understanding, no, it does not. However, the general perception is that children make the family.
Yeah, it reminds me of going back to Chapter 1 and 2, where they set out the legal definition of the family and how this contrasts to how we might feel about who's included in our family. But thinking long, historically and over time, there's definitely an association with a man and a woman getting married and having children. And so everything that deviates from that kind of stereotypical nuclear family gets challenged of whether they fit into this small box of what a family definition is. And so this chapter is trying to broaden that definition and just keep up to date with the changes in our society of all the ways in which families are formed.
You know, it's kind of another one of those things is like, who should identify these social structures? Should it be the larger society, or should we, like for most people, family doesn't require blood ties or children, but it's the sense of continuity, love, emotional intimacy, and that comprises, you know, who your family is. Of course, there's legal aspects that are a little bit different, especially when it comes to like inheritance and wealth and things like that.
It's just the perfect sociological topic because it really demonstrates how something so intimate and everyday to our experience is institutionally controlled. And so in this way, we can see that the church and the state regulate who's allowed to marry. And that has, of course, extreme consequences for who's counted as a family and who isn't. And so for folks who just, their family easily fits into this kind of parameter, they might not think about those people that are cut out of this narrow definition.
You know, everyone has some relationship to a family, whether they have the family, they were raised in a family, whatever form it is. Do we make the decision to have children? Should they be our own children? Should they be adopted? Then overall, if you look at kind of the macro dimensional aspects of population, you know, in order for population size to maintain itself, you know, there should be, there should be at least 2 children born for every, it takes 2 people, whether they're there or not, for a child to be born, kind of replicating yourselves. But we see that there's great variances in that over time.
And so the chapter starts out by just contextualizing where the American family is at, that half of the women who aren't married when they have their first child are actually living together, perhaps with a male partner who's the father of the child, or perhaps not. But, the shifting demographics of just the requirement of being in a marriage before you have children. So many children are involved with more than 2 parents. We might think about divorce impact on the family in that the child is left with 1 parent, but actually they might have 4 parents now. And so a very complex navigation between 2 households.
It is. And I think that there's always been this notion of like an unmarried parents as a deficiency, but there's a social control mechanism right there.
It's an interesting point that always comes up with my students because they're perhaps recently impacted by divorce. And so they often think about how not having a father around, say, has this negative impact on the family. But what I always want to point out is that the negative impact of not having a family in the house is a lot due to his paycheck not being in the house anymore. And so just that economic security is what a 2-parent household really provides. But if 2 parents are in a household together and they're fighting and creating, an unpleasant environment and negative impact on the child, that's an important consideration as well.
There was a book that was written by Reginald Clark called Family Life and School Achievement: Why Poor Black Children Succeed or Fail. And this is scientific study that provided evidence that it wasn't about the structure of the family, but it was about the quality of the interactions between the parent or parents and children. And part of that quality interaction really has to do with the financial sustainability of the family. Of course, there's some, attribution of the advancement of medical technology to increase the safety of and the health of the baby, of mothers who carry an infant, who carry a child after age 40, up to even age 50, depending upon the health circumstances. And there's also the idea that an adult is maybe more adjusted, they're deeper into their career, they make more money, they have a higher level of education if they're older. But on the flip
Mhm.
side, which wasn't really necessarily discussed heavily, is if you wait until you're in your 40s to have a child, you may be more adjusted, have more money,
Mhm.
maybe more mentally and emotionally prepared to have children. However, when you reach that peak of middle, midlife, if you will, energy levels deplete, and the
Mhm.
kind of the physical aspects of raising children become more challenging. I would have liked more of a thorough discussion of what are the impacts of having children later in life. It doesn't mean that's going to be easier.
Yes, absolutely. I'm someone who has an older parent. My mom was 30 and my dad was 50 when I was born. And so when I think back about when I was learning how to ride a bicycle at whatever age that is, 8 years old or something, I was like, damn, my dad was 58 pushing me around the block on my bicycle. So,
I normally ask my students in discussion posts what they think is the best time for people to get married. And of course, when you pose a question like that, full well knowing there is no best time, but
mhm,
it's a perceptual response. And I will get everything from like early 20s to, mid 30s, usually somewhere around there. But I've noticed on the younger side, there was a cultural and religious intersection to marriage. And as you said, there's also, how a person views himself in the collective arrangement of family versus someone who's more independent and is making independent choices, who may decide to marry later. There is definitely some intersections in those dynamics playing out.
and the chapter mentions something called the opportunity cost. And so, if someone does have a high powered education and career, then the sooner they have children and the more children they have, they're going to be giving up their time on their career, their money making potential. So there's an opportunity cost to each of these decisions.
And like you said, too, there's a relationship between education and income level. We know that, right? The higher the education, the greater the potential for income level, but also the greater the education, the greater autonomy on the job. That was
Mhm.
kind of the idea of conceptualizing what a profession is. And having autonomy on the job allows a greater flexibility in child rearing, rather than someone in, let's say, a pink collar or blue collar occupation who is punching a clock, who doesn't have that level of autonomy, could create greater strains in raising the children. There's definitely a lot of um, stats and information that's comparing education levels, the economics to child rearing, just to provide, again, some more contextual information.
So they talk about adoption. They have a section on adoption in the chapter. They talk about a century ago, most adoptions were secretive. Private agencies tried to match adoptive parents with children who were similar to them, especially racially. And so I think about, the time before Roe v. Wade, when, unmarried women really had to either get an illegal abortion or to get married, have a shotgun wedding, and marry the father of their child quickly, or they had to go away to these birthing homes. They suddenly disappeared from their high school with some flimsy excuse, and they went to this home for women where they gave birth, and then they were socially pressured to give up their babies for adoption because it was just so socially unacceptable for a woman so young to have a baby unmarried. And so now we see that adoption has completely shifted to, not a secretive event. It's usually known by the child that they were adopted, or has the chapter mentioned that previously the child didn't even know they themselves were adopted. And then of course we have the rise of, well, now it's more acceptable to have children outside of marriage, and so that helps the birth parents be able to keep their children just socially and not face this kind of cultural stigma. And also the rise of international adoptions, which has taken place, say, over the last 20 years or so.
Hague Adoption Convention really kind of reformed this idea of adopting first, finding homes for children within their countries. It says 19% of pregnancies that were not ended in miscarriage were ended through abortion.
And that represents, in the year 2014, 900,000 abortions. And this is down from the peak of abortions. I always ask my students, are the abortion rates rising or declining? Because there's always this moral panic around abortion rates. And so my students always think that it's it's rising and that it's this alarmist kind of situation. But actually, the height of abortion rates was 1980.
And then what was going on, in 1980, if you look at the recession and the Reagan years, and one of the primary reasons for abortion is just the inability to financially support and raise a child, especially when there's mass, economic instability within a nation. And so that's
Right.
like a period of 8 years.
The figure 9.7 was the birth and abortion rates by marital status. Just the extreme lopsidedness of it demonstrates also that folks that are in a marriage are going to be really pressured if they have a pregnancy to, give birth to that pregnancy, to not have an abortion. Because certainly we can understand that people are married, maybe they already have one or two children and they're deep into their career, and then they get pregnant. And so they're just going to feel a lot more social pressure not to have an abortion. There's probably a lot of stigma associated with having an abortion when you're married.
And there's definitely greater responsibility on the part of, both parents in a marital situation to make that decision together.
So the chapter goes on to have a section on the infertility rate. And so they define this as the failure of a couple to have a successful pregnancy despite deliberately having sex without contraception. And this is calculated over a 12-month period. So this is just another, definition and statistic that we should memorize as sociologists and to understand what it means.
Primarily a medical issue, and historically has fallen on the shoulders of women, being unable to reproduce, and as the example was discussed, which actually, if you watch The Handmaid's Tale, there's a nod to the story in the Bible of, if the woman cannot conceive, the servant will for her in that way. But
you're pointing out that it's just based on this stereotype of women being associated with childbirth, and therefore if there's infertility, it must be her fault. But as we know nowadays, medically, men certainly have a part in infertility. So we don't know if it's the man or the woman until you get an actual medical examination.
Exactly. But the whole idea that, I believe there's, the equal amount of medical issues around infertility between men and women. It's not just women. That is, again, part of the patriarchal manifestation of childbearing on the part of the woman.
You don't know why someone doesn't have a child, thinking that someone who doesn't have children is in that situation by choice, and that it was not a choice, So definitely quite a distinction between being infertile and being child-free.
Oh, you don't have children? Are you child-free or childless? How would they make the distinction? And to me, the distinction is childless means there's an infertility problem. There's some reason they want to have children, but they cannot. And a child-free is a conscious decision not to have children. And someone could decide that they don't want. I've known people didn't want children, and then 37 years old, they become pregnant, and then they just embrace it. So
Right. Some people have lost children. Some people, their child has died. Some people have suffered through miscarriages. And so when you ask someone if they have children, it can bring up these very painful, histories as well. And so that's just something for us to keep in mind.
I find that to be a private matter, to be honest with you.
Right. So
And that's
perhaps
probably,
our sociology ethics could encourage people to not ask potentially private questions, but just to let the person off and offer the information.
it is. And I think what it does, and as a sociologist, I wasn't like, I didn't feel offended or anything. I only evaluated that situation, which is not the first time. But it really made me think how important it is for people to reaffirm the choices that they made
Right.
by seeing if people made the same choices, right?
Right.
And like, oh, you didn't have children? Shit, I didn't want children, but you know what I'm saying? I did. Like, basically, I think they're determining whether or not you have conformed to social
Right.
pressures on a certain number of things, right? For
And
whatever reason
right.
they do that, but it's not just a question.
Yeah, and we definitely know that the child-free decision is controversial in this context where it's assumed that everyone has children and wants children. And so the child-free person is the stigmatized position.
Neglecting to say that child-free people, many of us actively participate in the lives of other people's children, whether being an aunt or an uncle or a mentor or people who teach.
Parent.
Right. All these things. There's different roles that people play when they did, by not having children. And I call it, like, if people's going to have children, no, I'm a supplemental adult figure helping. I believe in it takes a whole village to raise a child, but if everybody in the village have their own children, no one's going to be interested or have the time to help in the village. So I'm like, I can do it. That's going to work for me. That's enough for me to make that contribution. And I think it can be helpful to have supplemental help, especially in, what I would say, living in a major metropolitan area. There's a lot of people who are really disconnected from their extended family for a number of reasons. And so creating the families we choose might also mean that you are going to be have a role in the rearing of someone else's child in a small way.
Absolutely. So in the section on children's living arrangements, they just talk about the diversity of households that we do have now. And their comparison is 60 years ago, a household was with two married parents and with their children. And so in the figure 9.10, they talk about different living arrangements of children based on race and ethnicity from 1960 until 2016. And so we see just quite a difference in two-parent households versus one-parent household, and who that one parent ends up being, because it's predominantly the female parent nowadays.
This living arrangements section, from my kind of understanding of it, is there are forces that have changed the structure of the family, and often the structural changes can negatively impact the development of the child, being able to adapt in new environments, being able to really have strong social bonds with other people, and trust relationships. So there are some psychosocial dynamics that emerge when these disruptions occur.
And of course, they point out that family transitions always have an economic impact. And rarely does that impact, go in a positive direction, especially with a family separation. It's usually, people struggling financially after such an event.
Female-headed single-parent home with children, they may be forced to live with the grandparents for a period of time. And that's a huge transition, to live with grandparents or live with a grandparent part of the time. And there may be great differences in the way that they are raised in the grandparents' home versus the parents' home. That could cause some challenges as well. So the impacts, the stability, the impacts and instability that can occur, even like you said, if it's a better situation, is I think adults are more able to be resilient and be adaptable, but there's a certain sense of kind of simple, I call it simple continuity in the development of children's life as their brain develops, as their social behavior develops. Those are things are all that are happening, which are a lot to deal with as a child. But then if you throw in the mix an instability of the home environment could really impact those other developmental aspects.
So the chapter talks about parenting and the role of childhood, and they contrast this to 100 years ago when child labor was freely being utilized in our society. And they talk about children having these jobs even as a chimney sweep. So now we have a very different conceptualization of childhood, and it's a time of leisure and non-worry, hopefully, that the parents are trying to offer their children.
I also like to look at that in terms of the extended life expectancy as well. Children were treated as little adults. They can get into smaller spaces. They didn't eat as much. They didn't have to be paid as much. You know, um, it's quite oppressive if you really think about that. But if you only live to be 35, then you might as well start working when you're 8.
Right.
But if you live longer, kind of like living longer, has extended these developmental periods, and the complexity of society itself, I believe, requires a greater time in these developmental periods. I feel like children need to be children longer because there's so much that they're going to have to deal with, information wise, socially, economically, technologically, that previous not so distant past generations, have there was this life was a little simpler. So, I think that the degree of inputs was a lot less as well, which makes a difference in the development.
It just again shows the strong power of society over our individual lives, even just thinking about childhood, which probably a lot of us would assume is just some kind of natural stage, but it depends on your society. Is your society putting these children to work? Previously, 100 years ago or more recently, parents might have children because, like we mentioned, just the future security of who's going to take care of you when you're old, or you're on a farm and so you want lots of children to work on your farm, or maybe you have a small store that you could use more labor at. But now children are more of an economic liability, and they are an investment. You have to put a lot of money into the development of a child, and they cost lots of money compared to previous generations. And the chapter even points out, they say the parents of a typical family with 2 children today can expect to spend between 175,000 and 375,000 to raise each child up to age 17, depending on how rich the family is. And then after 17, the child maybe goes to college or maybe they tap out.
Well, that's funny too, up to age 17, where in my mind, people, how do I say it? People aggressively maintain their parental role until at least 23 or beyond, especially if if their young person is in college. They're not going to say, "Oh, now it's all on you," right? I mean, I think there's a socio-economic difference, right?
Yeah.
In the way that
We can
someone had
see
told.
this in the investment of the parents. Are you a $175,000 child or a $370,000 child? And these 2 children are going to be competing in the same world afterwards. They're going to go on into a college education, which is going to further separate them on the socioeconomic scale. And then we think about how they're going to compete for the same jobs and for the same outcomes later on. And so we see how this inequality is really at very early stages in life, and just the amount of money that the parent had to invest in this childhood.
I mean, there's no guarantee that that child is going to grow up as an adult and be able to take care of you when you are old and retiring. There is no guarantee that that child is going to be to exceed above and beyond what you have. And there's no guarantee that child that you have is going to fulfill the dreams that you were not able to fulfill, because and so if those are the reasons you're having children, then, that's where you kind of have to really come to the realization of that's not how it works. You could have a child who becomes a serial killer. You could have a child who, does not want to participate
They
in
dropped out of their med school after you paid all of that tuition or co-signed the student loans. Well, we just see the economic complications of having children in our modern consumer society. And then they go on to define the term intensive motherhood, or also known as intensive parenting, where parents do just really invest incredible amounts of time and money and resources into providing their child with an opportunity. And it just shows how competitive even childhood has gotten now in our society, which is really unfortunate, and just points to growing inequalities in our society. The chapter talks about how technology has transformed parenthood as well, and just how many more surveillance tools that parents have over their children. And so this starts in the crib. They might have a camera on the crib that they're watching from the other room just to see if their baby woke up, and then this can transfer to controls over the internet, the TV content, their phone, tracking devices on the phone in the car. It just reminds me of that Black Mirror episode where the mother was able to really survey her child all the time to a point of
like
obsessive
Angel Guardian.
compulsion.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah, that was really, it was very shocking. And of course it's, exaggeration, but it's an honest, truthful assessment. And the things that I think about that, and then I think about like how I was raised, where we didn't even have an answering machine.
Free range.
And I could get away with so much because there was just no tracking for me, So, maybe part of the adolescent exploration is having a certain level of secrecy and privacy. And I know people will disagree with me, but because of it doesn't mean that I don't think that you should feel safe, but I'm saying how do you build trust in that relationship if you're relying on these surveillance systems? That's like panoptician. That's like George Orwell, 1984 in a way, right?
Yeah, children need some space to fail and have challenges and
Yeah.
not have their parents run up and save them every time. Intensive parenting implies that the overprotectiveness and the over surveillance of the parent onto the child, and not allowing the child this freedom to just kind of explore their world and fail on their own terms. On the other hand, they mention spanking. And what was striking to me in this chart was just the consistency over time of these numerical differences of who agrees and disagrees with the statement, "It is sometimes necessary to discipline a child with a good hard spanking." But the lines look, almost flat. And I'm someone, I only received one spanking in my childhood. And I still remember it to this day. It was one of those situations where, mom told dad that I need a spanking and he was going to come home from work and spank me. So the anticipation of that event, I still remember today, but it's definitely, that was it only happened one time. And so I definitely survived in a childhood without any physical discipline.
Really, I realize as an adult the way in which um, I found physical violence to be like a normal part of relationships and a normal part of like moving through the world, always ready to fight, always, ready to use physical violence, not in a offensive way, but in a defensive way, right? Which to me, it's still the same result, right? If I'm defending myself violently, or finding myself in situations where violence comes to me and feeling okay about reacting that way. And I have to say that it had to come from years of being beaten. And as an adult, I had to take a considerable amount of time to be able to unlearn
Mm.
those responses, which I have because I don't believe in violence. So for many boys, getting whoopings, right, and being told not to cry, I'll give you something more to cry about, right? It was almost like you had to learn to stop yourself from crying and reacting to that perpetration of violence, even though it's considered discipline. And so I've noticed that I feel like men who are raised in households where crying is not, actively suppressed, have a greater connection emotionally to other people and to their own emotions. So I think it could stunt in that way. But also when we always talk about discipline and spanking, but I think even more harmful is verbal abuse, verbal and mental psychological
Right.
abuse that happens. And we're like, I didn't touch the child. I just told the child that they'll never amount to anything and they're worthless and I wish they'd never been born. That's all I did. You can't go to like the social worker about that. There's no bruises that you can see. So that is problematic. I call it like psychological torment, could be a problematic.
Right. I used to have this guest speaker come to my class, Dr. Brian Frank, who would talk about GLBT family formations, and he was really involved in a local organization. And he said, nothing brings you out more than having children.
On adoption day, we pretty much want it all. And what do you do after that? And you go to Disney World, right? I love this picture, right? It's a very happy picture, a very happy family time. But for me, I look at this picture and I see my family. But for a lot of other people, they look at this picture and what they see is a non-traditional family. And in particular, it's a non-traditional family in two very important ways. Number one, we're obviously a gay family. We have a saying in our community, which is that children bring you out like nothing else before, right? I mean, I thought I was out. I was out to my family. I've been out at several different jobs. I'm out to my friends. I'm out to somebody, who asked me casually. But just walking down the street, particularly as a cisgendered person, nobody really knows I'm gay. When you're doing this at Disney World, everybody knows you're gay, right? When you're walking down the street, your son wants to hold both your hands, everybody knows you're gay. When Darius and I go to the YMCA and we're going to swim and we're in the locker room and Darius says, "Hey, Papa, what's Daddy making for dinner?" Everybody knows you're gay. So suddenly this part of my identity, which I thought was all sort of completely settled out, came to be present in a completely new way and really changed the way that I relate to people. Because now, in some ways in that I've become somewhat more traditional in that I'm parenting a child, I've also become more non-traditional because now my gayness is really on display all the time. The other way in which our family is different is that our family is a transracial family. So to make distinction in the terms, if you're talking between the two adults in the marriage and the two parents, racial differences are interracial. Between the parents and the children, that's transracial.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. Yeah, it is. It's almost like the developmental aspect of someone's expression of their sexual orientation. It's a lot easier to come out with a partner. And then it's probably even more socially acceptable, not socially acceptable, but perhaps if someone sees a lesbian or gay person in a parenting role, they will see gay and lesbians differently.
Right. So then the chapter moves on to a section on fatherhood, which is quite short considering the significance of fatherhood within family formations.
Yeah,
but they do mention that of single parenting, that fathers are only 3% of single parenting. So it is, quite an outlier. So the majority of single parents are women.
A topic that obviously deserves more than 1.5 pages, right? Because there's socialization factors, even today, that prevent young boys from really developing those nurturing qualities. And I think I call it the simulation of parenthood. Whereas even today, I've even had open discussions in my classroom with my students, and some of which who said if your son was to pick up a baby doll and nurture the baby doll, what would you do? And they said they would immediately take it away from them. And some would even employ discipline and then start to question, to yell at them and say, boys don't do that, right? So if I heard boys don't do that, and then I grow up and become a father, I still hear boys don't do that. Boys don't change the diapers, which is completely ridiculous, right? Because men have the same ability to have the nurturing and empathy, and not every woman has that, even if she carried a child, right? So the fact that single fatherhood is so low there's a huge impact of socialization on that.
But this definitely impacts the role that fathers do play with their own children. And certainly today, men are a lot more engaged, and we see this in previous chapters, but it's really interesting. Like, this is not a biological thing, but just a sociological construction of how men are supposed to engage with their families.
Only a couple of photos with me and my father, and in each one, like, I'm sitting on his lap, but there's this general disengagement from me in his face. Like, it's not like how I see young fathers today interacting with their sons or daughters. Probably even there's a different, dynamic with daughters and fathers, but with fathers and sons, and to see that disengagement and realize how that played out in terms of not really having an emotional connection to my father. I just thought that's how it played out. You know what I mean? Fathers really don't have emotional connections, right?
So the chapter concludes with a section on assisted reproductive technology. And this is, an interesting topic, and I like to play documentaries on this topic in my class. But it is a very, very small percentage of all births. Let's see, the practice was first used in the United States in 1981 and now accounts for 1.6 of all babies born in the United States. But the overall thing is, this is a very expensive process, and it's a very taxing procedure on one's body and one's emotion, and certainly not covered by insurance. And so people spend huge amounts of money, and the outcomes are extremely slim. So there's a very, very slim chance of actually having a viable pregnancy after spending so many tens and tens of dollars on these procedures.
The other thing is normally in the procedure, there may be an implantation of numerous embryos, which could all come to term, right? So you may have only wanted one child, but the next thing you know, you have eight embryos made it. You're like, they're not all supposed to make it. And then you have like an octomom situation, but there are multiple births that result because of, this assisted reproduction technology, and that might not be what someone wants, right?
Yeah, so there's a lot of topics and ways that families come into formation in this chapter, and it's really interesting. I think that overall, what I learned is, not to make assumptions about people's family formation and how they ended up in a particular family or what their desires are, and perhaps to not ask these personal questions, and understand just the diversity of American families and how it's growing more and more diverse, and how we have to conceptualize our families and family life differently.
Yeah. And if you and your 3 dogs and 2 cats consider themselves a family, you're a family, damn it.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today for our Sociology of the Family class.
Thank you.
All right. Cut.